The sound of my heels clicking against the hardwood floor was sharp, precise, each step deliberate, controlled. A stark contrast to the chaos unraveling beneath the surface of my life. I had always been a woman who controlled the narrative, who dictated the course of events rather than reacting to them. But tonight, as I moved through the grand foyer of my Austin mansion, I felt something I hadn't in years. Rage. Not at myself. Not at Nick. But at the sheer audacity of the situation I now found myself in. I stopped in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the perfectly manicured grounds of our estate. The view had once been a source of satisfaction, a symbol of everything Nick and I had built together. Now, it felt like a cruel illusion, a facade that masked the rot festering beneath the surface of our marriage. I exhaled slowly, forcing the fury down, smoothing it into something more useful. Anger, in its raw form, was reckless. And if there was one thing I had never been in my life, it was reckless. At 40 years old, I had spent my entire adult life meticulously crafting my success. I wasn't just good at my job, I was the best. One of the most feared and respected financial analysts on Wall Street, my expertise could make or break corporations. My ability to see through numbers, to predict market trends before anyone else, had made me a name that executives whispered with both admiration and fear. Power was my currency, and I had spent 15 years trading it like a master. Nick had been my most calculated investment. We met at a high-profile investment conference in New York, both of us young, ambitious, and already making names for ourselves in our respective fields. He was a rising star in the medical technology industry, a man whose charm was as sharp as his intellect. He had the kind of confidence that came naturally to men who had never known failure, the kind that made people, investors, competitors, women, want to believe in him. Most women would have fallen for his easy smile, his charismatic arrogance. I wasn't most women. I didn't fall in love with Nick. I chose him. He was the perfect partner, not in the romantic sense, but in the way that truly mattered. We understood each other, both too ambitious to be tied down by the messiness of emotions. Our marriage was a power move, a strategic alliance between two people who wanted more out of life than just suburban bliss and PTA meetings. Children? A distraction. Romance? A liability. Respect? A vague, unspoken agreement. We built our empire together, our combined power making us untouchable. He dominated the world of medical technology, pioneering innovations that made his company a household name. I ruled Wall Street, my name spoken with both reverence and fear in corporate circles. We were a force, a machine, a perfectly oiled partnership. Until 6 months ago, when I realized I had lost the latest round. I found out by accident. It was a Tuesday morning, early enough that the house was still wrapped in the kind of silence I used to find comforting. Nick had left his laptop open in the kitchen, his usual arrogance making him careless. He had never worried about me checking his devices. After all, I never had a reason to. I had been looking for an investor report, something routine, when I saw the message thread. Emily. The name meant nothing to me at first. I assumed it was a business associate, another executive, someone from one of the many deals Nick was involved in. But as I scrolled through the messages, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just S**X. The messages were filled with plans. With promises of a future that didn't include me. It was the kind of relationship built on hope, the kind of connection that made men stupid. And Nick had never been stupid before. The moment I realized the depth of his betrayal, something inside me went cold. Not because my heart was breaking, no, that had never been part of our equation, but because he had underestimated me. Nick had made the grave mistake of assuming I would react like other women. That I would cry, beg, lash out in a fit of rage and storm out of the house in tears. He had forgotten who he married. I closed the laptop with an eerie calm, my mind already spinning through possibilities. There was a time when I would have confronted him immediately, when I would have demanded an explanation just to watch him scramble for an excuse. But I had learned long ago that the most powerful moves were the ones made in silence. So I did nothing. For 6 months, I played the role of the devoted wife. I smiled at charity galas, played hostess at dinner parties, and let Nick believe he had won. That I was oblivious. He brought Emily into our home. Not physically, he wasn't that reckless, but through the little things. The shift in his demeanor. The way he began staying later at work, the carefully crafted lies about business trips that I knew were spent with her. The arrogance of it all was almost insulting. Nick wasn't just cheating on me. He was daring me to notice. And that was unforgivable. I turned away from the window, my gaze landing on the dining table set for 3. Tonight was the night. The night Nick's perfect little fantasy would come crashing down around him. The table was adorned with white lilies, Emily's favorite. I had done my research, of course. I knew everything about her. Her favorite wine, the boutique where she shopped, the way she styled her hair to make herself look older, more sophisticated, as if she could ever compare to me. She was young, naive, a woman who truly believed that Nick would leave me for her. What she didn't know was that this wasn't just about an affair. I had spent 6 months digging through Nick's finances, unraveling the carefully hidden threads of his empire. What I found was far more interesting than a mistress. Nick wasn't just betraying me. He was betraying his investors, his partners, his company. And tonight, when he walked through that door expecting another night of deception, he would find something far worse than an angry wife. He would find me, not as his partner, not as his enemy, but as the woman who was about to end his entire world. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways. A confrontation in our living room, his face paling as I laid out every damning piece of evidence in a slow, calculated fashion. A dramatic public exposure at one of the high society charity events we attended, where whispers of scandal would spread like wildfire. Or perhaps something more personal, waiting until we were in bed, my voice low and deadly as I whispered the truth against his ear, just to watch his body go rigid with fear. But the truth was, none of those options were satisfying enough. Nick hadn't just cheated on me. Cheating would have been predictable, expected, inconvenient, certainly, but hardly devastating. No, what made this betrayal unforgivable was the sheer arrogance of it. The audacity of a man who believed he could walk through the front door of the home I built, sleep in the bed I chose, drink the wine I stocked, all while planning a future with a woman who would never be my equal. He had underestimated me, and I would make sure he paid for that mistake. The night I found out about Emily, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat at my desk, pulled up his financial records, and started digging. At first, I was simply looking for her. For proof of gifts, dinner reservations, flights, anything that would show me how deep the deception ran. But what I found was so much better. Nick wasn't just hiding an affair. He was hiding millions. Offshore accounts, dubious consulting fees, unaccounted for transactions tied to shell corporations that didn't officially exist. It was like peeling back the layers of a rotten fruit, one lie leading to another, each more damning than the last. I had spent my entire career tearing apart corporate financials, exposing fraud, and bringing down men who thought they were untouchable. I had destroyed billion-dollar empires with nothing but spreadsheets and a well-timed call to the right regulatory agency. And yet, my own husband thought he could outmaneuver me? The sheer audacity of it almost made me laugh. For weeks, I watched them. Nick thought he was being discreet, but men like him always were just careful enough to convince themselves they were untouchable. He had a routine. A weekly dinner at an upscale restaurant, always under the guise of client meetings. A second phone, sloppy but expected. An apartment downtown, leased under a shell company that was little more than a placeholder. Emily, for her part, was painfully predictable. She posted cryptic messages on social media as if she was living out some great, star-crossed love affair. Some things are worth the wait. The best things in life don't come easy. She took pictures of expensive meals, never tagging anyone, but always careful to show a hint of a man's arm, the edge of a watch. She was a child, playing house with a man who would never be hers. I learned everything about her. Where she worked. Who her family was. What perfume she wore. The kind of nonsense she pinned to her wedding inspiration board, because yes, she actually had one. She truly believed she was going to be the next Mrs. Lawson. And that made it almost too easy. Tonight was the night. The dinner invitation had been sent. A carefully worded message from Nick's phone instructing Emily to meet him at our house for a private discussion. She arrived first, of course. I watched her through the security cameras as she stood on my doorstep, shifting nervously from foot to foot. She was dressed carefully, but not too carefully, trying to look effortless, as if she hadn't spent hours deciding what to wear. She rang the doorbell once, then twice, before I finally opened the door. The look on her face when she saw me instead of Nick was priceless. "Oh," she stammered, blinking rapidly. I think I have the wrong Emily." My voice was smooth, practiced. "Right on time." She froze. I stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. The hesitation was brief. She was young, but she wasn't stupid. She knew this wasn't normal. She knew something was off. But curiosity or arrogance won out. She stepped inside. The dining room was set beautifully. White lilies, her favorite, arranged in an elegant centerpiece. A table set for 3, soft music playing in the background. I watched her take it all in, her throat working as she swallowed hard. "Nick will be here soon," I said, pouring a glass of wine. "Why don't you sit?" She obeyed, slowly lowering herself into one of the high-backed chairs. "You know," I mused, swirling the wine in my glass, "I never really took you for his type." Emily flinched. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, don't insult me." My voice was still light, but there was an edge to it now. "You knew he was married. You knew exactly what you were doing." Her lips parted, the beginnings of a protest forming, but I cut her off before she could launch into whatever pathetic excuse she had prepared. "Do you love him?" Silence. Then, finally, a hesitant nod. I smiled. "That's unfortunate." The front door opened. Nick's voice rang through the house, casual, unaware. "Hey, babe, He stopped. Emily turned, her expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "Nick." His face went white. I didn't move. I let the silence stretch between us, let him feel the weight of it. Then, slowly, deliberately, I reached for my laptop. "I hope you both enjoy the presentation I put together," I said, pressing play. The first slide appeared on the screen. A photo of Nick and Emily, taken outside their apartment. The second slide, hotel receipts. The third, offshore bank transfers. Nick made a strangled sound in the back of his throat. "Laura." I held up a hand. "I'm not finished." The fourth slide was my favorite. It was a contract, one that detailed Nick's involvement in illegal technology sales. Signed. Dated. Complete with evidence I had meticulously gathered over the past 6 months. Nick's jaw dropped. Emily looked at him in horror. "Nick, what is this?" He couldn't answer. He was too busy realizing that the game was over. I leaned back in my chair, smiling. "You didn't just cheat on me, Nick," I said, my voice silky smooth. "You betrayed me. And I don't take betrayal lightly." The next slide contained a simple message. Sent to IRS, SEC, DOJ, FBI. Nick's face crumpled. Emily was already pulling out her phone, scrolling through her messages. I knew what she was seeing because I had made sure those photos, those receipts, those damning pieces of evidence were now in the hands of her entire professional network. "Nick," she whispered, eyes filling with tears. "What have you done?" I tilted my glass toward them in a mock toast. "Enjoy dinner," I murmured. Then I stood up, smoothed my dress, and walked away. Let the destruction begin. I didn't look back as I left the dining room, but I could feel the weight of their stunned silence behind me. The room where I had orchestrated their downfall was no longer my concern. My job was done. Or at least, the first phase was. I took my time as I walked toward my study, my heels clicking against the marble floor in an unhurried rhythm. Every detail of tonight had been carefully curated, every moment choreographed down to the second. But the real masterpiece wasn't just exposing Nick's affair. That was the least of his problems. Because while Nick had spent the last 6 months lying to me, I had spent them doing what I did best. Gathering data. Running numbers. Tearing apart the empire he thought he built. By the time I reached my study, my phone was already buzzing. Right on schedule. The first notification popped up, a secure message from my attorney. Divorce papers filed. Good. The second was from my contact at the SEC. Received and reviewed. Formal investigation in motion. Perfect. And the third? A security alert. Nick had just attempted to access his offshore accounts. I let out a small, satisfied breath. He was scrambling. Panicking. Good. I had been patient, methodical, calculating. But now? Now, it was his turn to feel powerless. I leaned against my desk, watching the live security feed from the dining room. Nick was still frozen in place, his face pale as he stared at the damning evidence on the screen. His fingers hovered over his phone, as if trying to decide which fire to put out first. Emily, on the other hand, was unraveling. Her wide eyes darted between the slides, the photos, the financial records, the messages I had sent to her boss, her colleagues, her family. She reached for her phone, her fingers shaking as she scrolled frantically. A small, cruel part of me enjoyed watching the realization click into place for her. She had spent months believing she was special, that Nick had chosen her, that their affair was some great love story instead of the tired, predictable cliché it truly was. But now? Now she understood. Nick hadn't just lied to me. He had lied to her. She turned to him, voice trembling. Nick, tell me this isn't real. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth opened and closed, but there was no explanation that could save him. Because this wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about fraud, money laundering, insider trading, things far more serious than late-night rendezvous and cheap hotel rooms. Emily took a slow step backward, clutching her stomach like she was going to be sick. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What have you done?" Nick finally moved. His hands slammed against the table as he surged to his feet, the panic in his eyes barely restrained. "She's lying," he shouted, turning toward me like he could somehow *midate me into taking it all back. "She's making this up. Laura, this is insane. You." I raised an eyebrow, my voice cool. "Am I?" Nick's jaw snapped shut. He knew I wasn't bluffing. Because deep down, he knew exactly what I was capable of. Emily, still shaking, turned her gaze back to the screen. And then she saw it. The final slide. Her name. Her email. The money Nick had wired to her account over the past 6 months, gifts, rent payments, suspiciously large consulting fees. It didn't take a genius to see what it looked like on paper. "Oh my God." Emily's voice cracked. "Oh my God, am I?" I tilted my head, watching her. "An accomplice?" I supplied, my tone almost gentle. She made a small, broken sound. And Nick lunged toward me. "You bitch." I stepped back, perfectly composed as my study doors burst open. And just like that, security was there. 2 men in suits, large, imposing, moving with a practiced ease as they intercepted him. Nick thrashed, but it was useless. "You set me up," he spat, his face red with fury. I smiled, slow and sharp. "No, darling." My voice was silk. "You set yourself up. I just made sure you couldn't talk your way out of it." His eyes were wild now, searching for some kind of way out. But there was none. The accounts were frozen. The evidence had already been sent. His business partners? They had received copies of my findings an hour ago. His investors? Gone. His career? Over. Nick had power. Now, all he had left were consequences. Emily was still crying when I turned back to her. "Don't worry," I said mildly. "You won't be going to prison." "Probably." Her head snapped up, tears streaking her perfect makeup. "What?" she choked. "Well, that depends." I tapped my nails against the desk, considering her. "You could be implicated." But I let the word hang in the air, savoring the moment. "If you're very cooperative with the authorities, I imagine they'll go easy on you." Her breath hitched. Nick twisted in the security guard's grip. "Don't you dare." Emily didn't even look at him. She was still staring at me. Because she knew what I was saying. I was offering her a way out. Not just from Nick's mess, but from him. It was a lifeline. And I saw it, the exact moment she took it. Her spine straightened. Her lips parted. And then, voice barely above a whisper, "What do you need me to do?" Nick screamed. I smiled. And just like that, it was over. By the time the authorities arrived, Emily had already given her statement. Nick was arrested on the spot. The house, the empire he thought he controlled, was no longer his. It was mine. Because while he had spent the last 15 years believing I was just his wife, just a woman who stood by his side, watching, I had been planning, calculating, waiting, and tonight I had taken everything. As Nick was dragged away in handcuffs, his eyes found mine. I saw it then, the realization. The fear. He finally understood. I had never been his equal. I had always been his superior. And now? Now, he was just another man who made the mistake of thinking he could betray me and win. I stepped forward, leaning in just enough for him to hear me. Checkmate. Then I turned on my heel, walking away without a second glance. Because Nick's story was over, and mine was just beginning. The night was crisp as I stepped outside, inhaling deeply, filling my lungs with the sharp bite of victory. The sky stretched above me in an endless expanse of dark velvet, stars glinting like polished diamonds. It felt poetic, standing beneath a sky so vast, so utterly free, while Nick sat in the back of a police car, bound and powerless. Fitting. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. Not just because I had won, but because I had done it on my terms. I hadn't begged. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't let emotions dictate my choices. I had calculated. I had waited. And now? Now I was free. I glanced back toward the house, where the last of the evening's chaos was being wrapped up. Emily stood near the doorway, her arms crossed over her stomach, her expression hollow. She wasn't crying anymore. She just looked drained. And I understood. Tonight, she had been forced to see Nick for what he truly was. A liar. A manipulator. A man who had never loved her, who had used her, just like he had used everyone else. I should have hated her. And for a long time I had. But now, watching her tremble beneath the weight of her own shattered illusions, I only felt pity. Because at the end of the day, Emily wasn't my real enemy. She had been a piece on Nick's chessboard, just like I had once been. The only difference? I had learned how to flip the board over. I walked toward her slowly, heels sinking into the gravel. She stiffened as I approached, her fingers tightening around the thin fabric of her dress. "Are you going to ruin my life now?" she asked, voice hoarse. "Destroy me, too?" I tilted my head, considering her. "No," I said at last. "You've done that well enough on your own." She flinched. I didn't enjoy kicking her while she was down, but I wasn't about to comfort her, either. She wasn't an innocent bystander. She had chosen to be with a married man. She had known he was lying to someone. She had just been foolish enough to believe he wasn't lying to her. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "About the money. The offshore accounts." "I swear I didn't know." "I know." She looked up, startled. I shrugged. "If I thought you were a threat, I would have handled you differently." She swallowed, her throat bobbing. "Then, what now?" That was the real question, wasn't it? I had spent months planning Nick's downfall. Now that it had come to fruition, what was next? "Go home, Emily," I said quietly. "Get a lawyer. Cooperate. They'll go easier on you if you do." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. She turned to leave, then paused, glancing at me over her shoulder. "Did you ever love him?" The question caught me off guard. I should have left. Scoffed. Said something scathing, something cold. Instead, I simply exhaled. "No," I admitted. But for a long time, I respected him. Emily nodded, as if that answer made sense to her. Then, without another word, she disappeared into the night. I didn't watch her go. She was no longer my concern. Back inside, my study was quiet. The screen on my laptop had gone dark, the last remnants of the presentation still glowing faintly in the dim room. I sat at my desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and typed one final email. To Michael Carter, CEO, Lawson Tech. Subject, resignation. Michael. Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position as CFO. Given the circumstances surrounding Nick's recent arrest, I trust you will understand my decision. I wish you and the company the best moving forward. Best. Laura. I hit send, watching as the message vanished into cyberspace. Nick's company was not my responsibility anymore. He had made his choices. Now he would live with the consequences. I sat back in my chair, exhaling slowly, rolling my shoulders to release the last of the tension coiled beneath my skin. It was over. And for the first time in years, I was truly free. The next morning, I woke to a flood of messages. The media had caught wind of the scandal fast. Headlines were already splashed across financial news sites. Nick Lawson arrested in fraud investigation, medical tech giant under fire. Lawson Tech's fall from grace. CEO faces federal charges. Financial analyst Laura Lawson plays key role in uncovering corporate corruption. I smirked. I had always been content to work behind the scenes, to let my numbers speak for themselves. But now, the whole world knew what I had done. And I had never felt more powerful. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Laura speaking. A familiar voice hummed in amusement. You move fast. I straightened. Michael Carter, Nick's former business partner. One of the few men I actually respected in this industry. I knew you were smart, he continued, but this was next level. I smirked. I do my best. You know, he mused, Lawson Tech is looking for a new CEO. And I think you've proven yourself more than capable. I laughed. Tempting, but no thanks. I was done cleaning up Nick's messes. Michael chuckled. Figured as much. But if you ever change your mind, my offer stands. I paused, because for the first time in years, I had no plans. No husband. No job. No obligations tying me to the life I had built. And that was exciting. Thanks, Michael, I said at last. I'll think about it. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, the new one, the one I had secured for myself long before Nick's world came crumbling down. I sipped my wine, watching the city lights flicker like stars. For 15 years, I had played a role. The devoted wife. The brilliant CFO. The woman standing quietly behind her husband, letting him shine. But now there was no Nick. No company tying me down. No expectations chaining me to a life I no longer wanted. For the first time in forever, I was free to do whatever the hell I wanted. I smiled, raising my glass to the skyline. To new beginnings. To reinvention. To the woman I had always been, hidden beneath layers of patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now the whole world knew her name. And she was just getting started. Nick had always prided himself on being untouchable. Even now, even as the walls of his carefully curated life collapsed around him, I knew some part of him still believed he could fix it. That he could smooth talk his way out of this, the way he always had. He wasn't built to lose. He didn't know how. And that made watching him crumble all the more delicious. I had spent years studying men like Nick, men who thought their power was absolute, their control unshakable. They all shared the same fatal flaw. Arrogance. They weren't prepared for someone like me. A woman who didn't just react to betrayal, but anticipated it. A woman who didn't cry, or beg, or break. A woman who waited. Who planned. And then? Who burned their entire world to the ground. The full extent of Nick's downfall was set in motion the moment he was placed in handcuffs. The first domino had fallen. And now? Now it was carnage. By morning, every major news outlet was covering his arrest. The headlines were brutal. From tech titan to criminal, Nick Lawson's fraud scandal rocks the industry. Lawson Tech stock plummets following CEO's arrest, investors in panic mode. Exclusive, the woman behind Nick Lawson's downfall speaks out. That last one made me smile. The interview had been carefully orchestrated. A single, controlled statement to the press. Just enough to let the world know that I had orchestrated his undoing. That he had underestimated the wrong woman. And now? He was paying the price. By noon, the real damage started rolling in. Nick had spent years cultivating allies, investors, board members, powerful people who had believed in him. But power was fickle. And the moment you became a liability, they turned on you. One by one, Nick's so-called loyalists abandoned him. Lawson Tech's board held an emergency meeting, issuing a public statement distancing themselves from his crimes. Investors pulled their funding. The company's stock free fell. And the best part? I had timed my own exit perfectly. By the time the scandal broke, I had already cashed out my shares. Every dollar legally mine, sitting safely in an account Nick could never touch. He was drowning. And no one was coming to save him. Nick's lawyer tried calling me. I let it go to voicemail. His mother called next. I ignored that, too. Then came the texts. Nick, Laura, please. Let's talk. Nick, they're freezing my accounts. I need help. Nick, this isn't you. You're not this cruel. I stared at the last message for a long moment. Nick had no idea who I really was. He never had. I let the message sit unread before finally typing out a response. Me. You should have read the fine print. Then I blocked his number. The fallout continued over the next 48 hours. Nick's home, our former mansion, was seized as part of the investigation. His assets were frozen. His company formally removed him as CEO. He had nothing left. No money. No power. No reputation. All that remained was the wreckage. My wreckage. And he knew exactly who was responsible. The next time I saw him was at his bail hearing. He was dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit, borrowed, I assumed. He looked hollowed out, his usual arrogance replaced with something closer to desperation. Good. Emily wasn't there. I wasn't surprised. She had already cut a deal with the authorities, throwing Nick under the bus the moment she realized just how deep his crimes ran. His lawyer tried arguing for leniency. Nick was a pillar of the community, after all. A successful businessman. A family man. I had to fight back a laugh at that last one. The judge wasn't impressed. Bail was denied. And as Nick was led out of the courtroom, he looked at me for the first time since that night in our dining room. I didn't smile. Didn't gloat. I simply tilted my head, watching him. And I saw it, the realization settling deep in his bones. That he had lost. That I had won. That he had never really been in control. Not ever. That night I celebrated. Not with a party. Not with champagne or grand displays. No, I celebrated the way I always did. By planning my next move. Because while Nick's story was over, mine was just beginning. I had spent so many years tied to him, building him up, standing by his side, playing the role of his perfect counterpart. But I wasn't his anything anymore. I was free. Free to start over. To rebuild. To thrive. I had resources. I had power. And most importantly, I had time. For the first time in years, I wasn't bound to someone else's future. I was crafting my own. And I had no intention of wasting it. I poured myself a drink, standing by the window of my penthouse, watching the city lights flicker below me. This was my world now. And I was ready to conquer it. Nick always believed he was the smartest person in the room. Even as his empire crumbled, as his name was dragged through the mud, I knew some part of him still thought he could fix it. That if he just found the right words, the right deal, the right person to manipulate, he could turn it all around. But this time, there was no fixing it. No charm. No negotiation. No second chances. His collapse wasn't just inevitable, it was absolute. And I had made sure of it. 3 weeks after his arrest, the media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. The once revered Nick Lawson, tech visionary, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Nick Lawson's fall from grace, from billionaire to criminal in under a month. Lawson Tech's legacy destroyed by CEO's greed. Could the company survive? Inside the mind of a fraudster, experts analyze how Nick Lawson lost everything. And then, my favorite. His wife knew all along, and she took him down herself. It was a half-truth. I hadn't always known. But once I did, I had wasted no time making sure the entire world saw him for what he really was. His legal team had all but abandoned him. Oh, they had tried, at first. The usual defenses. The desperate attempts at damage control. But then, when the real evidence started rolling in, the offshore accounts, the falsified contracts, the backdoor deals, one by one, they started dropping him. Nick's new lawyer was a public defender. A far cry from the high-powered legal teams he had once boasted about having on retainer. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. The court hearings were brutal. I didn't attend all of them, I didn't need to. The case against him was airtight. Too much evidence. Too many burned bridges. Too many people eager to bury him. Emily testified first. She had taken a plea deal, probation, community service, a permanent black mark on her record. But she wouldn't serve time. And in return, she handed them everything. Emails, bank statements, phone records. Nick had never been careful with her. He had underestimated her, just like he had underestimated me. And now, her betrayal was the final nail in his coffin. When she stepped off the witness stand, she didn't look at me. I wasn't sure if it was guilt or shame. Either way, I didn't care. She had made her choices. And now, she had to live with them. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty. On all counts. Nick Lawson, once a billionaire, once a household name, once a man who believed himself untouchable, was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. No appeals. No reduced sentence. Just time. Time to think. To sit in a tiny cell, stripped of every ounce of power he had ever wielded, and stew in his own failure. I had won. Not just the battle. Not just the war. But everything. That night, I poured myself a drink, sitting on the balcony of my penthouse, the one Nick never knew about, the one I had secured long before I started dismantling his life. The city stretched out before me, glittering, alive, limitless. And for the first time in years, I wasn't tied down. No husband. No company. No obligations keeping me chained to a life I no longer wanted. I was free. And the future? It was mine to shape. Whatever I wanted. Whoever I wanted to become. Nick had spent his whole life believing he was untouchable. But in the end, it wasn't some rival that destroyed him. It wasn't the market. It wasn't bad luck. It was me, his wife. The woman he had spent years believing he could lie to, deceive, discard. He had thought I would accept it. That I would be just another forgotten casualty of his ambition. He had forgotten who I was. What I was capable of. And now? Now the whole world knew. I raised my glass to the skyline, smirking. To reinvention. To power. To Laura Lawson. And to the next empire I would build. Without him. 3 months had passed since Nick's sentencing. 3 months since I had walked out of that courtroom, my heels clicking against the marble floor, his stunned expression burned into my memory. And in those 3 months, I had rebuilt. Reinvented. Thrived. While Nick sat in a prison cell, stripped of his fortune, his reputation, his power, I had never been more powerful. I had been Laura Lawson, the wife. Now I was Laura Miller again. And Laura Miller was unstoppable. My new office in San Francisco was sleek, modern, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view that stretched all the way to the Golden Gate. It was mine. Every inch of it. I had taken the payout from my Lawson Tech shares and built something new. Something better. An investment firm. One that specialized in fixing the messes left behind by arrogant, reckless men like Nick. Within 2 months, we were already handling accounts worth billions. By the third, we had secured exclusive contracts that Lawson Tech would have K*led for. Poetic, really. While Nick wasted away in prison, his former competitors were lining up to work with me. The irony was delicious. I kept tabs on Nick. Not obsessively. Just enough. His prison record was predictable. No major incidents. No fights. Just a slow, steady decline. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone. He had been humbled. And if there was any justice in the world, he was finally understanding what it felt like to be powerless. To be at the mercy of someone else's choices. To lose. Exactly the way he had made me lose. Emily had disappeared. She had fled town shortly after the trial, her career ruined by association. I wasn't sure where she went. I didn't particularly care. She was a footnote in the story. A temporary obstacle. An irrelevant piece on the chessboard that had been cleared once she was no longer useful. And as far as I was concerned, she could stay gone. I sat on the balcony of my penthouse that evening, the city humming beneath me, a glass of wine in hand. Michael Carter had called earlier. Another job offer. Another opportunity to expand my empire. I hadn't given him an answer yet. Not because I wasn't interested, because I was. But because for the first time in years, I was moving at my pace. No husband. No obligations. No one else's expectations dictating my next move. For 15 years, I had built his world. Now, I was building my own. And this time, no one was going to take it from me. I smirked, raising my glass to the skyline. To freedom. To reinvention. To the woman Nick had never seen coming. To me. And to the empire I was about to build, one far greater than he ever could have imagined.